All right, well, I think we're going to go ahead and jump in as people continue to join. So let's go ahead and just kick things off. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. We're so happy to see you here. Really appreciate you taking the time during your lunch break in the middle of the week here. So my name is Elizabeth Beavers. I'm a national security legal scholar and a strategist for peace and security advocacy. I support civil society efforts to advocate for a demilitarized and democratized U.S. foreign policy. And I'm really delighted to be in this briefing event and want to thank Brown University's Costs of War project for hosting us. So, something I work on quite a bit is U.S. military spending. And I think this paper that has just come out and this event that we are doing is incredibly timely. As you all know, I know we have several Hill staff here with us. Congress is still deliberating on the fiscal year 2023 federal budget. And by all accounts, I know they're not finished yet, but by all accounts, the U.S. military budget is set to hit a record high. There was some reporting last month that there are proposals from current and former U.S. government officials that U.S. military spending should rise, should come to at least 5% of U.S. GDP, which would put us above a $1 trillion military budget. Now, of course, I think Congress is not quite there yet, but they're not too far off. Last year, Congress appropriated about $29 billion more than President Biden requested. This year, he has requested more than $800 billion in defense spending, and Congress appears poised to give even more than that. The House and Senate Armed Services Committees have proposed respectively $37 billion and $45 billion of increases above what he has requested through the National Defense Authorization Act. But we'll see where things end up. But I think we can kind of all see where things are headed. And something that I know I am hearing quite a bit is that this is necessary in order to be prepared to deter and to confront Russian aggression. And so that's why I'm really excited to have two of just the absolute biggest and best experts on this particular topic to help me understand it better and to push back on some of that conventional thinking. So I am just really excited to be joined today by Lyle Goldstein, who is the director of the Asia engagement with defense priorities. He also served with the U.S. Naval War College for 20 years. He is visiting professor with Watson Institute, which is the sector of Brown University that houses the Cost of War project. Bill Hartung, probably everyone knows Bill Hartung. Bill is with the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. He also previously was with the Center for International Policy, and he is a well-renowned expert on the military budget. His commentary frequently appears in multiple media outlets. So I am just delighted to have both of them here, and I'm going to hand it to Lyle first. Lyle, your new paper that you have just published with the Cost of War project suggests that this conventional thinking that the U.S. must bolster its base defense spending in order to be prepared to confront and to deter Russia, that thinking may be wrong-headed. Why is that? Tell us about it.
Well, thank you so much, Elizabeth, and Bill. Thanks also for being here. Maybe I'll just share my screen and jump right in. But I should say, if you notice the art behind me here, you'll see I'm mostly a China specialist, but in addition to Chinese, I also happen to speak Russian. I've spent a lot of time in Eastern Europe, and so of course I've been watching closely what is going on. So when I was asked to deliberate and offer some thoughts on the war, I was thrilled to do so, especially with this outstanding program at Cost of War, which has just done amazing things for our country and for the whole world over the last decade. So I'm pleased to share some of my thoughts here. I'm just going to start a timer here, lest I talk your ears off. You know how professors are. Well, like I said, I speak Russian fluently, so it does help to be able to see what some of the Russian defense analysts are saying. And as you can see over there on the top, that on the top left, you can see they're deliberating about what to do about HIMARS. On the right, you see one of several articles they've written comparing the current war to the fiasco of a war that occurred in against Finland just before World War II. And that war is known universally among Russian strategists as a complete disaster. So, I mean, they're being quite candid that they see this in large part as a failure. But what's so disturbing here, and the point I want to underline over and over, is this graphic in the center there. You see, you probably read the headlines today that Putin, even this morning, as we read about the speech he made several hours ago, articulated a rather clear nuclear threat. I think this is very disturbing. I'll be going over the words again and again a couple of times, but among the things that he said, you can see in red there, he said, "This is not a bluff." Okay, and that, to me, we need to take this extremely seriously. So I think this discussion could not possibly be more timely. Indeed, it was just in the middle of last week, I was looking over Russian military media, as I often do, and came upon this article which said that, here you see on the left, that it says this might be an ideal time to use Russian tactical nuclear weapons because Ukrainian formations are massing in such a way that they could cause a major destruction to those forces. So the nuclear danger here it has been rising and rising. And I'm very glad to see, according to the New York Times, according to this article from Sunday, that President Biden is focused on this, and that is as it should be. He said, we're trying to avoid World War III here. I'm wondering, the sentence actually said this is something he often tells his aides. I almost wonder to myself, why is it that he has to tell his aides that? That's a little disturbing. We can maybe discuss that a little bit. But the bottom line here is that none of this should be terribly unexpected. Russia is a large country, but it's also a very weak country. We've known that for a long time. I guess this paper is simply a reminder of that fact. And look at the tremendous disparity in defense spending. The United States spends well over 10 times what Russia spends, which, if you think about it, is quite incredible, and really is reflected in the war that we're seeing, where Russia has trouble doing what we would consider relatively simple military operations. This lays out the disparity even more, because when we factor NATO in, we see that if you take NATO aggregate spending, by the way, it doesn't include Japan, and Russia does not have a good relationship with Japan, so they have to plan against Japan too. But Russia spending versus NATO aggregate is a mere 6%. Okay, so to me, adding more to that, adding more to the Pentagon, adding more to this disparity is not going to help. It may make things worse. Indeed, I do think it's probably part of the problem. And when you see just how grave the disparity is, you can see that Russia, as was put in a New York Times article this morning, is sort of cornered and is more dangerous than ever, kind of like a cornered rat, I think, to use Putin's own phrasing. Look at this. I worked at Naval War College, so I tend to focus on the naval balance. There's no balance. It's total and stark imbalance. We have more than 10 times the number of aircraft carriers, never mind other large surface combatants across the board, many more nuclear submarines, for example. And then when you look in the air, and of course, air power is of critical importance, we, again, have much more air power. And let's not even talk about the very strong navies and air forces of our allies, Britain, France, again, Japan. So this actually understates the disparity. Now, there is one anomaly here. It's the main battle tanks, of course, but you know as well as I do that from just reading the papers over the last months, we know that Russian tank forces are highly really quite backwards. This is mostly reflecting just large stocks of obsolete tanks, and they have not been successful at all in fielding new main battle tanks onto the battlefield. And I just want to emphasize that Russian strategists are fully aware of these grave disparities and frankly, incredibly nervous about it. And here's one, for example, I looked at from 2020, where this is a fleet combat model developed by the Russians that shows that in terms of combat power, the Russian Navy wields well under 50%. By the way, these bars represent years. So in 2007, the green bar here, you could say that maybe they were over 60% of our combat power. But subsequently, gradually, they've come down over time to be less than 50% of combat power. Again, does not include the Japanese fleet, the British fleet, the Dutch fleet, and so on. So this disparity is very grave. And, you know, of course, Russia behaves like a cornered animal, desperate, lashing out constantly. Let's look at some other evidence of how the Russians themselves appraise their own forces as very weak, and a weak showing in the Ukraine war. Here's, for example, shows how the ground forces are severely undermanned. They're very candid about that. It shows that they have failed to adjust to drone warfare in large respect, and were sort of caught blind on this. On the air power, they have not been able to deploy their air power effectively, and that has been noted with great frustration on the Russian side. And the Navy also has performed rather below expectation, even according to Russian appraisals. They're quite candid. But what's really disturbing here, folks, is that this very stark conventional weakness, which is evident across the board and frankly has been for a long time. I mean, if you follow Russian military affairs, you know that they've been having a continuous slew of accidents, really, you know, since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Before that. But here you see that as NATO is increasing its power, which it clearly is, you know, just by adding Sweden and Finland, for example, even Russian strategists say very clearly, our only response will be to lean ever more heavily on nuclear weaponry. Okay, so the conventional imbalance is partly driving the nuclear tensions that we're all aware of now. Here's, for example, Alexei Arbatov, who's really universally considered the most important Russian nuclear strategist. He's saying the risks are greater today than they were in the Cuban Missile Crisis. Think about that. I'll return to that point. Here's another Russian strategist saying there's only one option to stop the flow of NATO weaponry, to use a dozen tactical nuclear weapons. Okay, think about that. This would be utterly devastating for the world and for Eastern Europe in particular. Here is an example. I watched some Russian television, and you know, they're openly talking about the use of tactical nuclear weapons almost on a daily basis. So just to wrap up here, you know, let me make 5 concluding points here. Russian conventional military power has proven even weaker than we expected, although looking at the numbers, we should have known this. Now, NATO allies are increasing their defense expenditures. It may be unnecessary, but actually, you know, it is, I think we can expect this to happen. And this is probably good for the prospects of peace in Europe. And it's certainly good for the United States, which has been paying way too much in this respect. But I think it also, we can talk about this more, but I think it will support the prospects for peace. And there is this nuclear paradox, which I'm talking about, and Russia spends, it doesn't spend much on its military, but the little it does spend, it spends largely on nuclear weaponry, and including exotic nuclear weapons. We can talk about those. This is really scary stuff, folks. I did my PhD in nuclear strategy and never would have imagined we would arrive here. So the real risk of escalation remains. I thought that a week ago, but I think with this morning's news and over the weekend, I'm even more convinced of this. We really have no excuse to further pad the Pentagon budget, and we had better be aware of the dangers of continuing in the direction that we've been going in with this very grave disparity. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Lyle. It's a fascinating paper, and I think it's going to be really helpful for staff and for advocates alike. So Bill, I want to turn to you, and quickly before I do that, I just want to remind the audience to utilize the Q&A function of the Zoom if you have questions you'd like to submit to the speakers. At the end, we're going to open it up for discussion, and that is where I will pull questions from. So please do submit those as we continue. All right, so Bill, you have been studying trends in the military budget for quite some time. Do you share the concerns expressed by many that the U.S. government is underspending on its military, given the challenges posed not just by Russia, but also by China? What do you think of that? Oh, Bill, I think you're on mute.
how many times can a person do that? So quite the contrary. I think a lot of people don't realize how enormous the current proposed budget is. $850 billion if you count nuclear weapons work at the Department of Energy, which is far higher than the peaks of the Korean or Vietnam Wars or the height of the Cold War. So, in fact, as Lyle mentioned, the US spends 10 times what Russia spends. We could spend 20 times or 50 times. That would not have affected Putin's calculations about whether to go into Ukraine. A lot of it's about policy, it's about strategy. It's not just about amounts of money. He's not sitting there with a calculator saying, oh yeah, I see it's gone up, 30 billion. I'm going to stop doing this. So, if you want to deal with that, it's a separate matter altogether. The other thing to consider is that the Ukraine war is being funded primarily through emergency appropriations. So all that weaponry going to Ukraine, there's been $23 billion authorized for arming Ukraine and US allies in Eastern Europe, which is far higher than the peak of security assistance to Afghanistan at the height of that war. It's the biggest infusion of military aid in this short of a time at any time I can remember, perhaps except for the Lend-Lease program leading up to World War II. And even that may not be the case. So you've got this 23 billion, another 7 billion that the president is requesting this month. So the vast majority of that is not in the Pentagon-based budget. So if the concern is about supporting Ukraine's right to defend itself, that's already well taken care of. And so in a sense, to also increase the Pentagon budget is a form of double dipping, which I think we should not allow to happen. Now, some have said, well, but as a deterrent, the US needs to expand its presence in Eastern Europe. Well, there's already 100,000 troops in Europe. European countries already spend, as Lyle said, about 5 times what Russia spends, and that figure's going up. Germany's increasing, Poland's increasing, many other European countries are increasing their military budgets. And given Russia's relative weakness, as evidenced by its performance in Ukraine, the idea that they would turn around and try to attack a 30-nation alliance in NATO, I think is infinitesimally small that would happen. So for all those reasons, I think increasing spending because of Russia, because of Ukraine, makes no sense. Now, of course, the other major rationale being given for these levels of spending is China. And it's been described by the Pentagon as the pacing threat. But if we want to get paced with China, we would actually have to reduce our military budget because we spend 2.5 times what China spends. We have 10 times as many aircraft carriers. We have a more capable Navy. We've got 13 times as many nuclear weapons in our stockpile. So if you just put the numbers together, and of course, that's not counting Japan, Korea, Australia, all the US allies in the region, of which China has no comparable set of alliances. And India is being kind of brought in to the equation gradually, or at least the US is attempting to. So given all of this, again, it's not about spending, it's not about alignment of forces alone. A lot of it is politics, strategy, diplomacy. And if the United States is going to make provocative statements about sending troops into Taiwan to defend against a theoretical Chinese move against Taiwan, that's going to violate the one China policy, which has kept the peace in that region for decades. And we really need to work on that problem and also work on the need to cooperate with China on things like climate change, preventing future pandemics, stabilizing the global economy. All of these things have huge ramifications for the future of the world, especially climate change, which is an existential threat over the medium term. So you can't, on the one hand, be preparing to fight a war with China, and on the other hand, be cooperating with them on what in many ways are greater threats to the future of humanity. And of course, China is a nuclear armed power. So the notion of a conflict with China raises huge risks of escalation. And Lyle is a deeply knowledgeable expert on this, has done written books, read original primary sources and so forth. So if more comes up on that, he's well equipped to go further than this kind of big picture that I'm laying out. And then, of course, of that $850 billion, much of it is being wasted. It's not available to deal with China or Russia or anything else. For example, price gouging. Companies like the TransDigm Group have charged as much as 3,800% markup on small spare parts for the Pentagon. And there's just a small sampling of what they have done, plus all the other suppliers doing similar things. And you're getting into billions of dollars wasted. The Pentagon doesn't even know how much it is because they can't pass an audit, the only major federal agency for which that is the case. So that's an invitation to waste, fraud, and abuse. Then you've got cost overruns on things like the F-35, which does not perform as advertised, may never be fully ready for combat, as the Project on Government Oversight has demonstrated. You've got $13 billion aircraft carriers, many of which are vulnerable to modern missiles and are not by any means a forward-looking investment in the defense of the United States or its allies. And then you've got bureaucracy. One study by the Defense Business Board suggested there was $25 billion a year in waste related to just overhead at the Pentagon. And then in addition to that, the department employs over 500,000 private contractors, many of whom do redundant jobs or jobs that could be done more cheaply and effectively by civilian government employees. And if you take that out of the equation, if you capped that and just reduced it by 15%, you'd save another $26 billion a year. So there's easily $100 billion or more to be saved. And there's a new legislation being sponsored by Representative Barbara Lee and Representative Mark Pocan, which is already building co-sponsors, I think 20 so far, but Elizabeth is the latest on that, that talks about cutting $100 billion, which is in line with scenarios set out by the Congressional Budget Office, by a task force I worked on at the Center for Financial Policy, by the Cato Institute. And if you do things like take a realistic view of how to address the challenges from Russia and China, scale back this global counter-terror operation, which has not been done despite this talk about big power focus. So there's 800 military bases. In any given year, there may be 85 counter-terror operations in 85 different countries. There's still a strong, large U.S. Naval and military presence in the Middle East. All these things could be scaled back if you had a more restrained defense-oriented strategy, and not one that's involved in kind of a cover the globe strategy that wants to intervene anywhere in the world on short notice, which, as we've seen in Iraq and Afghanistan, has not served us well. And Brown Costs of War has laid that out in great detail. $800 trillion in expenditure, hundreds of thousands of civilian deaths, hundreds of thousands of our vets having physical and psychological wounds that have yet to be fully dealt with now that they've rotated back to the United States. So that kind of intervention policy could not have been more disastrous, and it needs to be kind of stripped out of our Pentagon planning. And we don't need the $1.7 trillion nuclear weapons modernization plan that's underway. Deterrence can be served equally well with existing systems and reduced numbers, as Global Zero has pointed out in its alternative nuclear posture that it's developed. So if you take all these things together, not only can we defend the country better for less, but many of the things we spend on are either wasteful or provocative, and therefore undermine our security. So it's exactly the opposite of kind of the conventional wisdom that more is always better. More can get you into deep trouble, as it has done over the last 20 years. And so it's time to take a look at how to downsize Pentagon spending and invest in some of the other less traditionally discussed threats to our safety and security. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Bill. To the audience, thanks to those who have already submitted questions. Please do pop them into the Q&A function. I do have a couple of questions myself, and then I want to jump into the discussion because there's so much here to jump into. So my first question is just a really quick one. I really want to just hone in on the scope of this new paper and this discussion we're having, which is the type of spending we are talking about. This paper and the conversation, I just want to clarify, Lyle, correct me if I'm wrong, is not about, we're not talking about the supplementals or aid to Ukraine. We're talking about proposals to build up the conventional base US military capabilities using Russia as a rationale. Is that correct, Lyle?
Yes, that's right on point. The paper does not address issues of aid to Ukraine really at all, and it's just focused on what additional spending, which, you know, I agree with what Bill said. It's just completely unnecessary. But worse than that, it's probably, well, in my mind, certainly making the situation more unstable.
Great. I think it's really important to clarify that because I've seen certain members of Congress and some sort of commentators just sort of loosely say, like, Russia, just sort of generally as a reason for why spending must increase. And I do think sometimes it gets conflated, like what exactly is it that we're talking about? So that's a really helpful clarification. Thanks everyone who's still dropping questions, comments in the Q&A. I see those hands. Thanks so much. Okay, so for both of you, another question I want to ask you, and you have touched on this a bit in your presentations, but I really want to drill down into it. I think there are many who agree with you that the challenges posed by Russia, if we're being honest, do not merit an increase in US military spending, but many of those same people believe that the challenges posed by China do in fact merit an increase in the US military investment. And so I want to ask both of you, what's your reaction to that?
Yeah, well, I'll be happy to lead off here. As Bill pointed out, I am often wearing a China hat, and that's actually, I've written several books on Chinese strategy. So I'm really, you know, this is an issue dear to my heart. And I can't tell you how many times I encounter Russia specialists who say, well, you know, the real threat is not Russia, it's actually China. That's a very common theme among Russia specialists, you know, even today. And then you get the opposite, where, you know, you get in a room full of China specialists and they say, oh, it's nothing to worry about with China. What you got, your problem is Russia. So there's a bit of playing this kind of baseball game or something, batting the threat. Look, I study both countries, lived in both countries, I speak both languages. They're very different, and lumping them together, as we constantly do, is quite wrongheaded. Although they both do have some, you know, a lot of concerns about the United States. But in general, I would say if we talk about China, sure, China's military is significantly stronger, better funded, better trained, better disciplined than is Russia's today. So, you know, those of many people have concluded from the Ukraine, what's happened in Ukraine, that, oh, no problem defending Taiwan, we got this, just pile them up with HIMARS and weapons and so forth, and Stingers and the rest of it. I don't agree with that. You know, China is indeed a very formidable country, but here's the real difference between China and Russia. Russia takes some crazy risks out of desperation, mostly, but probably also somewhat of a cultural thing. China is much more cautious, and while China has a more serious military capabilities in some respects, not nuclear, but otherwise, but if we look at Chinese intentions, and that's critical, we don't see evidence of a threat. You know, we've worked together with China on a lot of economic development issues, on climate. They have peacekeeping forces all over the world. They're standing in harm's way and helping out. On proliferation situations, China's been quite helpful. And most important, and people need to realize this, unlike Russia, which has occasionally resorted to the use of force, you know, Georgia and so forth, China has not. since 1979. It's going on half a century of not using force and instead behaving very cautiously. So trying to exaggerate the Chinese threat, saying they want to take over the Pacific or take over, conquer Japan or something, it's lunacy. And boy, I see more and more of it in Washington.
Yeah, just to reinforce that, we've done a couple of things at Quincy. My colleague Michael Swain has done a long piece on threat inflation, the history of threat inflation, both with respect to China and other potential adversaries. Back at the end of the Cold War, Colin Powell said, and this is sort of a paraphrase, "I'm running out of enemies here," meaning, how do you justify a high budget if you don't have an enemy to point to that's got comparable capabilities? And I think a lot of that is happening now with respect to China. And if you look back, there was a National Defense Strategy Commission back in 2018, mandated by Congress, that critiqued the Pentagon strategy. And the bottom line was, we're not spending enough. The Pentagon's not being hawkish enough. And we need to spend 3 to 5% above inflation forevermore increase in the Pentagon budget to deal with Russia and China. Now, this was not an unbiased commission. A majority of the members came either from the boards of arms companies, were consultants for arms companies, or came from think tanks that were heavily funded by arms companies. So they came from inside the DC bubble. And so they were naturally inclined in this direction. But I think a more sober assessment along the lines of what Lyle laid out would be a better guide. The other thing I'd say is that Quincy has done a longer piece on a more defensive approach towards China called active denial, which would rely more on allies, would not push up against China's shores, would not, take an offensive posture, and estimated could save up to $75 billion a year. So yeah, I think, Lyle, did you have a?
Well, yeah, if you don't mind, I would also say I meant to mention that some of what is going on in Ukraine is of course causing Russia and China to coalesce more. And so I am very concerned that, again, Russia in rather in desperation, which I think really is kind of the primary motive here as I see it, turns more and more to China and may take moves that in the long term are somewhat threatening. But the way to deal with that, instead of lumping them together and pushing them closer, is to try to kind of mitigate the tensions.
A question we have from the audience is if either, and you all can decide how far you want to go down this road, but if your analysis changes if China were to initiate conflict around Taiwan.
Well, I do think we should stay focused on the report, and on Russia, I would just offer that, I've done a lot of work on Taiwan, and there'll be more. It is, many would say, it is the most dangerous place in the world. And in a few words, my assessment is that, Taiwan is a bridge too far for the US to defend, that we have treaties with Japan and Philippines, and we should uphold those treaties. And those areas are rather easily defended. That is Japan and Philippines. That's not the case with Taiwan. Taiwan is 90 miles off the coast of China. As Bill implied, I think we could double or triple our defense budget and still we couldn't defend Taiwan. It's just too far away and it's too close to China. And if you understand the history and the politics, you'll see those do not suggest we should do this anyway. So, as we saw in Afghanistan, we should stay out of civil wars. I thought we learned our lesson with Vietnam, but folks, Taiwan and China is also a civil war. Most Americans don't know, but the actual constitutional name of Taiwan is not Taiwan, it's the Republic of China.
Yeah, well, fair enough. Staying on the topic of Russia and this paper, we have another question from the audience. How can some analysts, politicians, and U.S. military officials have exaggerated Russian and before it the Soviet military power so dramatically? And why have they exaggerated and mischaracterized Russian military power so dramatically? And then, of course, the question I think many of us ask, why do these same people have so much legitimacy as military analysts, given these errors that have likely led to hundreds of billions in unnecessary military spending with other damaging effects? And if these same analysts are doing the same with the Chinese military. So that's one of our eight-part questions that we have from the audience there, but quite a bit for you all to react to.
Yeah, either way, Lyle, you referenced the paper, sort of the history of threat inflation. Do you want to go into that, or you want me to start?
I could talk a little bit about the history because I think it is important. But I mean, there's so many examples from the Cold War of threat inflation. You'd think that again that we would get this out of our system somehow, but I mean, some of the really disastrous policies involving threat inflation. We somehow got convinced that Vietnam was where democracy had to be defended. We had to defend the sacred democracy of South Vietnam. It was an incredible national disaster, set our country back decades, and we lost so many Americans. And what about how many people in Southeast Asia died? That's just one example. Another one I talk more about in the paper is the missile gap, where if you go back and look at the details, the Air Force intelligence in 1957 said the Soviet Union had about 500 ICBMs. Actually, they had 2. This has happened again and again. We've made horrible mistakes, and we have to be on guard for this. And my quick answer to that question, and then I hope Bill will follow up. But look, there's something in the human brain, in my view. It's almost like a chemical reaction that says, we need to pull together against an external enemy. So xenophobia, I think, is kind of hardwired into our brains, but enlightened people need to reject that and see that this is just kind of maybe makes us feel good. It sells newspapers. I know it's good for defense companies. It is not good for the United States, not at all. And we need to re-examine these policies that have again and again caused threat inflation. Go ahead, Bill.
Yeah. Well, I think if you look at 2 periods, the Committee on the Present Danger, which pushed against détente in the 70s, and a lot of those folks populated the Reagan administration. It was kind of a exercise in political mobilization, more so than a careful analytical look at the subject. And then some of those people and their acolytes were also talking about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, liberating Iraq, the Project for the New American Century, which included, as a director, executive of Lockheed Martin, had people like Paul Wolfowitz and others, who architects of the Iraq War. So, that record of failure, as suggested in the question, you would think would disqualify these folks from being consulted as serious experts on any foreign or security policy matter. But it's almost the reverse. I feel like if I was wrong more often, I'd be a consultant to CNN. So why is that? I think some of it is conflict sells, crisis sells. People seem to be more inclined to look at foreign challenges than challenge of gun violence down the block, divisions within our democracy, how to address our contribution to climate change. Those things it's a more diverse set of challenges. It's a little harder to kind of generate fear and anger about. So I think we have work to do on that front, but I think it can be done. Kind of shift that viewpoint.
Oh, I just wanted to add here. I meant to say this incredible threat inflation that occurred during the Cold War. Some studies have been done actually to total up how much Americans spent on nuclear weaponry during the Cold War, and it comes out to about 10 trillion in today's dollars. And I just stop a minute and think how much better our country would be off if we had spent that 10 trillion on schools, infrastructure, clean water, clean energy. I mean, it would be a different country. And so we had better keep that in mind as we go into this new Cold War. We're really going to set our country back so dramatically with this diversion of monies to the weapons industries in unnecessary conflict.
Definitely. And actually to that end, I'm going to exercise my privilege to answer one of the questions that's come in. Someone's asked about taking action. This person has mentioned that they appreciate the academic approach that we're bringing here, but asks about action. And for my part, this is me speaking in my capacity as a strategist supporting the People Over Pentagon campaign. Bill mentioned this legislation in his comments, but if people are looking to take action, HR 8040 on the House side is the People Over Pentagon Act that would call for cutting $100 billion from the Pentagon budget and reinvesting in other priorities, which is something Lyle just mentioned. So that would be my recommendation there, and would absolutely love to help build co-sponsorship there. Okay, so our next question, we have a request for Bill to tell us more about the nuclear weapons industry and current policies supporting continued and increased profits for the industry. And so, Bill, I'm sure you might even take it beyond nuclear here. Who profits from when these proposals for increases are accepted and as the military budget continues to go up?
Well, starting with the big picture, the House proposal to add $37 billion to the Pentagon's request, $25 billion of that went to weapons production or R&D, which benefits primarily the big contractors. $1 billion went to the troops. So this whole concept that we need to increase the Pentagon budget for the troops is being contradicted by the way the money is being spent. And, contractors get more than half or close to that of the Pentagon budget. And the top five, Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Raytheon, General Dynamics, Northrop Grumman, split over $150 billion a year in our tax money. In a recent year, Lockheed Martin alone got $75 billion, which is far in excess of what we spend on the State Department, which is just a glaring example of misplaced priorities in our foreign and military policies. Now, in nuclear weapons, I've looked at this and done studies on the nuclear weapons lobby, and it plays out in a couple ways. First of all, they're building a new intercontinental ballistic missile, which could cost well north of $100 billion over the period that it'll be built and utilized. 264 billion, if I recall correctly, and that is led by Northrop Grumman, but its subcontractors include big hitters like Lockheed Martin, General Dynamics. They've got a kind of a pact with the members of the Senate who have nuclear weapons ICBM bases in their states, and that Senate ICBM coalition, with the help of these contractors, has blocked virtually every effort to inject some rationale into this policy, either to reduce the numbers, to study alternatives, even to destroy the unused silos that were left over after the New START agreement. Any change of any kind, modernizing instead of building new ones, this coalition has successfully blocked those with the aid of industry. So, and as I mentioned, we could have a more than adequate deterrent without building these things. And Secretary of Defense, former Secretary of Defense William Perry, calls them the most dangerous weapons in the world because they're more likely to be used quickly. President could have a matter of minutes to decide whether to use them in a crisis, increasing the possibility of an accidental war based on a false alarm. So you've got this unnecessary, dangerous system that's being kind of propped up by company profits and pork barrel politics to the detriment of our security. And if you look at the other legs of the triad, the bomber, the submarines and so forth, they've all got their own lobbies. And there's the Submarine Industrial Base Council. There's the Air Force Association, which lobbies heavily for new bombers, and on and on. The industry associations, the campaign contributions, the revolving door from the nuclear bureaucracy to these companies. So a lot of this is being driven by special interests, not the national interest. I think it's outrageous, and I think if more people knew about it, there'd be much less support for throwing all that money at a new generation of nuclear weapons.
Lyle, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, yeah, I found myself over in Groton, Connecticut, standing in the missile tube of one of these new generation SSBNs, thinking to myself, if this is ever used, this will be the end of the planet. I think reasonable people can see that there probably is some floor, some small deterrent that's important, but so much of this is truly is waste. And let's not forget what a huge role the degradation of arms control, which seemed to be a special mission of the Trump administration. But I have to say, the current administration has not done much good here either. And as I said, I follow the Russian press and the Chinese press very closely, and this was all noted. The end of open skies, for example, the end of INF. Each time this occurred, and when we put missile defense capabilities into Eastern Europe, Putin was very clear. Okay, I will respond. I will go ahead with all of these nuclear programs, and they have a lot now. I have to say, Russia has many new and fairly modern nuclear weapons. Think about that, folks. So their conventional weapons are very weak, but their nuclear weapons are reliable and devastating and ready to go at a moment's notice. Is that good for the United States? No, it's we're pushing them more and more in this direction. It's extremely dangerous. And by the way, the Chinese are also watching what we're doing. And I could tell you, China, for example, today studying very carefully tactical nuclear weapons. Why? Because they know that we just deployed low-yield nuclear weapons for the first time in a long time into our fleet. So, they will answer. And that's the logic of Cold War. And this will bankrupt us all. And of course, if we roll the dice enough times on these crises, whether Ukraine or Taiwan or whatever, one time we'll lose our planet.
Speaking of the logic of Cold War, another question here is something, Lyle, I know you spoke to quite a bit in your paper, which is the history of threat inflation more generally, and specifically, of course, with regard to Russia. But I'm wondering if you could just take a minute to elaborate a bit more on what history shows us about the consequences of threat inflation.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's been incredibly costly. I just had the occasion to read a very fine biography of George Kennan, and you see actually early in his career, he even made some proposals along the lines of a way in which Germany could be unified at a much earlier point. And of course, the kind of threat inflation mafia more or less destroyed him at that point early in his career for daring to think that maybe if Germany was kind of united and neutral, that would make the Soviets a lot less paranoid. And you see, there were ways to diffuse the Cold War. And let's not forget, we're now at the coming up on the 60th anniversary next month of the Cuban Missile Crisis. I mean, this is the most dangerous point ever faced by mankind. And the more we learn about it, the more dangerous it is. And we're headed in exactly the same kind of direction. So I think, if we there's this tendency now among journalists and in the DC mafia to equate Putin and Hitler and Xi and Hitler and to throw around terms like genocide all the time. This has become very de rigueur, but it's this is part and parcel of how we continue to come up to the edge of war and are constantly putting all of our best minds and all our national wealth in the hands of the military-industrial complex, as Eisenhower warned us, because of this constant, what I think is kind of a psychological need for an enemy. Some have called it enemy deprivation syndrome. We seem to have it in spades.
Bill, I don't know if you have anything you want to add to that.
Well, I think Kyle did a good job. I mean, it's cost us trillions of dollars, and it's put us at the brink of possible end his life as we know it. So it's not just a kind of insider Washington political game. It's got very serious consequences.
Well, speaking of kind of getting outside of the insider Washington mentality, I'm going to combine a couple of questions here. One is someone's asking if you all know if any of the original SANE activists are still involved in anti-nuclear work, such as printing the projected blast zones on U.S. cities or targets for public consumption. And then someone else asks more generally, why do we think the U.S. population allows this obscene bipartisan military spending to continue?
Yeah, well, there are activists who are around, even going back to the ban the bomb movement of the late 50s, the movement to end nuclear testing, which got at least the end of overground testing. The organizational development, SANE merged with the nuclear freeze campaign of the 1980s, which helped put 1 million people against nuclear weapons in Central Park, got referenda around the country in favor of a freeze and so forth. And now has become Peace Action, which is still quite strong in many states and is a supporter of things like the People Over Pentagon Act. And I think there was a reference to making people understand the consequences of nuclear use, as Helen Caldicott did so successfully in the 80s. And groups like PSR, Physicians for Social Responsibility, have done studies about the devastation to be caused even by a relatively small use of the huge global arsenal, in terms of not just millions or hundreds of millions of people die from blast and radiation, but the possibility of a global famine that would affect billions of people. So that element of the argument is still present. I think it's not as present in the public consciousness. We live in a kind of an infotainment society where people are bombarded. Most Americans know more about the Kardashians than I knew about ICBMs, I would imagine. And so part of it is public education. Part of it is a lot of people feel like they have no influence. How do you influence the government? And I think this has been a problem across the board on all kinds of issues. So I think we need to inject a notion of hope that there's been cases in the past in our history where mass mobilizations have had huge impacts, be it the end of slavery, the women's movement, the civil rights movement, which now has got a parallel in the Poor People's Campaign, which is picking up on the message of Martin Luther King about economic justice and an end to the war machine. So I think there's a core to build on, and we need as many creative ways as possible to engage people, and especially to remind them that even small actions that they take, if enough of us take them, and if there's enough of a ripple effect, we can make a huge difference. And I think that's maybe the biggest hump to get over, is just people taking ownership of their own power.
Yeah, I think it's a very good question. And I've looked very hard at the Taiwan scenario and at the Ukraine war. And I do believe that both, unfortunately, have real serious risks of nuclear escalation, in different ways. And this is, in just the idea that we may get sucked into a limited nuclear war or a total nuclear war is just, I think it's unforgivable, really, that our leaders have, allowed it to get to this point. If you read the piece by Roger Cohen, who comments on Putin's speech today, it's shocking. There's a sentence in there where Cohen says, rather cavalierly says, Putin said he's not bluffing, but maybe he is bluffing. Maybe, I can't believe that we're at a point where we're willing to gamble our planet like that. It's just striking to me, and it shows a lot of how irresponsible some of our public figures are, to me. A friend of mine brought up this point, which I think is really interesting. He said, maybe it's that, I grew up in the 80s. watched the day after. I thought that, you know, I grew up in Washington, D.C. I felt very acutely that my family, my home, my friends, we'd all be vaporized really quickly. And of course, our parents lived through the Cuban Missile Crisis. I wonder if a new generation of leaders can grasp this. I mean, why does Biden have to remind his aides that he is trying to avoid World War III, for God's sakes? It's unbelievable to me.
Definitely. Well, we've just got another minute or two here. There's two quick requests. I don't know, Lyle, if this is a hassle, but we have a request for you to post your first slide again. The audience wanted to take another look. And then, Bill, we have a request for you to the alternate nuclear power paper you mentioned. If you have the link for that, I can share it with attendees.
Yeah, it's not easy to get quickly, but I'll send it to you and anybody.
No problem. I'll send it in the follow-up. Thanks everyone for these requests. Yeah, I'm not sure which slide. Yeah, maybe this was it, sort of the collective here.
Yeah, please be in touch. Love to collaborate on possible future work along these lines. We're doing our best to show the costs of war, wars that have happened, but the costs of war in the future, of preparing for catastrophic wars.
Absolutely. Well, with that, we are just about at time. So I'm going to go ahead and thank everyone for joining us. I know everyone has Zoom fatigue, but it's really exciting to see you all here during your lunch break. Thank you, Lyle. Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Cost of War Project, for producing this paper and hosting this event. We will be in touch with the recording with these follow-up materials. And thank you all so much.